I want to thank Bluebird Bio, the sponsor, for putting this together, and certainly recognize Don Hahn and Ted Slocum, who are the co-chairs of the ARM Reimbursement Committee. As you've heard already throughout this meeting, there's a real robust reimbursement agenda that we've got, and if you're not participating in our committee or our activities, we certainly would welcome your participation. So we have a great panel today, which should be a really interesting discussion. It's meant to be interactive, so by all means, feel free to raise your hand and ask questions. Without anything further, I'll turn it over to Doug Dannison from Bluebird.
Great. So, thank you, Michael. And is this on? Cool. So welcome to the Coalition of the Truly Interested at 7:15. So I'm glad we could see who's really interested in stuff and who's just has passing interest in market access. It's always a pretty good separator. Today we're going to carry on to the theme from yesterday was more about payment and what I call value capture. This is more about value demonstration. So how you can demonstrate value in these different systems. And we've, and hopefully to identify some issues that as different manufacturers should think about as they're preparing their products, but also some areas where maybe ARM can start to think about engaging in terms of policy and maybe gaps in systems that we need to think about as a group. As yesterday Jeff said, Jeff Walsh, our CFO, said this shit is hard. So it's good the message is getting across to the C-suite, and I totally understand that, which is good during budgeting season. We all, good for that. So we're going to carry on some of those themes today. We did, Clark and a team of folks of he'll acknowledge, came up with the exemplar case, which is sitting on your chair. And so this is going to kind of serve as kind of a center for our discussion. We're not going to focus solely on that, but I think this will help tee up the issues, because otherwise we'll just talk in generalities, and we didn't want to do that. We wanted to make sure things were kind of highlighted. And then as you look at the different representatives, they can speak from their particular points of view on what works and what doesn't. So I'll go ahead and let the panel introduce themselves, and then I'll kick it off with some questions, and I'm sure we'll roll with there. And next thing you know, the panel will be over. Go ahead, Jim.
Good morning. It's 10:15 where I live, so that's why I can be here this morning. So my name is Dr. Jim Cross. I'm formerly with Aetna. I was their vice president of medical policy and operations, which meant that I was responsible for reimbursement and clinical policy, as well as all the national operations run out of a central location. I left Aetna last June, and I've been doing some traveling and semi-retiring, and a little bit of healthcare consulting.
Good morning. My name is Bill Dreitlein. I'm Director of Pharmaceutical Policy at the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review, or ICER, and that is an intentional play on words. I am a pharmacist, so I'm a bit of a fish out of water here, swimming with virologists and CEOs and people who know a lot about cells, a class that I didn't do so well in pharmacy school. But my experience and I've seen the healthcare system from a number of different angles, both as a practicing pharmacist, from academia, working for a pharmacy benefit manager, supporting a large pharmacy and therapeutics committee that would decide whether a drug got on formulary or not, and then dealing with the pharmaceutical companies trying to explain that decision. And then I've also worked on the other side, working for a marketing company that helped pharmaceutical companies tell their value story to payers. So now I'm at ICER, and ICER, if you don't know, is an independent nonprofit organization that does technology assessment. We write about 9 reports a year on new drugs, new technologies, or devices, or other interventions, and we hold meetings to discuss those. And it's all out in the public domain. So things that used to be done or are done in many companies within a kind of a closed environment, a lot of the work that we do is out in the public. So anyhow, I'm here today pleased to be part of this panel, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you. I'm Keith Tolley. I'm from the UK, so I'm at 3:15 in the afternoon now. So I'm wide awake and ready to go, and have been for some time now, actually, today. So My background is I am a health economist. Bill can say he feels a little bit like a fish out of water. I think as a health economist, I'm even more of a fish out of water. And what do health economists know about regenerative medicine? You could ask. But however, health economists are pretty important in the UK in terms of health technology assessment and decision making, and the assessment of new medicines and new therapies like regenerative medicine. So we do have an important part to play, even if we're not as educated as you about the cell therapies and the like. I have my own consultancy as a small health economics agency that helps produce the sort of economic arguments and models that you need in the UK and in other European and other countries around the world increasingly to demonstrate the cost effectiveness of new medicines. So I help pharmaceutical companies and others to develop those models. The other part of my work is that I have a contract with one of UK's 3 health technology assessment bodies. We have 3. The big one is NICE, the National Institute for Clinical Excellence Health and Excellence, sorry. And I don't directly work for them, although I have made many submissions to NICE and built many models or been involved in many models that have gone to NICE. The body I work for is the smaller one. We have a separate one in Scotland called the Scottish Medicines Consortium, and they perform appraisals of every new medicine that comes. So every one of medicine you may be involved in, therapy you may be involved in, will be seen by at least the Scottish Medicine Consortium or by NICE. And there's another body I work with in Wales. We always forget there is 3 parts to Great Britain. There is Wales as well, and they also have their own health technology assessment body called the All Wales Medicine Strategy Group, and I do some work for them as well, appraising new medicines. So that's my sort of background.
Hi, good morning. I'm Clark Paramore. I head up value demonstration at Bluebird Bio. I've been doing health economics, pharmacoeconomics for about 20 years, but I'm not officially a health economist. But in our field at ISPOR, we all say that we're health economists, but there are actually officially health economists out there in the world that do this stuff. We have been focused on a value demonstration for regenerative medicines in the last year and a half. It's been a great opportunity to join Bluebird and work on this because there's a lot of unique issues. So I look forward to today. We did develop this case study thanks to Pfizer and BioMarin on the reimbursement committee at ARM for helping to put together this hypothetical. It's not always easy to pull that off, so we look forward to discussing that and then taking it broader if we need to. So look forward to it. I'm Doug.
Great, and I realized I didn't introduce myself. I'm Doug Dannison. I lead market access at Bluebird Bio. So I've been doing market access in some form for about 16 years, mainly on oncology. So cell and gene therapy is actually a fun change, but a lot of similarities too. So I'm going to kick it off with some initial questions. Just as the panel have asked each of you, what did you guys think of the package as you looked at it? What are some of the things that stood out in terms of endpoints and comparators, safety profile, comparator or lack thereof, or sample size? Just a couple points just to get the group warm.
Oh yeah, and one clarification if you are reading the case study. We all agreed, and it was my mistake to not take it out. There are going to be no randomized controlled studies in this area. It's single arm. So for our assumption for today's discussion, single arm data, no randomized comparator. That was, I want to make sure that was clear. The panel knows this now, but I wanted to make sure the audience is clear. So anyway.
So that's one of the things I was going to mention.
There you go. Shocking.
So we would not probably consider this level 1 evidence. Single arm or retro studies are level 2. Most payers initially look and hope for level 1 evidence, which is usually multi-center randomized controlled trials with a control arm and not a single arm. So that's one of the big things that's going to stick out right away. Now, you have to take that with a little grain of salt in the sense that not all technologies or treatments lend themselves to randomization. There may even be some studies that are not ethical to do in a randomized approach. There are rare diseases and certain cancers and other situations where it just wouldn't be ethical to expect that there be a randomization. There are some procedures that are so different, so invasive, and the other procedure is so non-invasive that it would be unethical to expect the patient to actually pick a more invasive approach versus a non-invasive approach. So there's lots of examples where single arm is what it is. So I think that given the space that you guys are in, it may well be that you can sort of generally prove or show. One of the things that you may want to demonstrate is that this is really an area where single arm studies are all that you can do for whatever reasons. The other two things that stuck out in my mind were the N number. After the initial trials, which are usually small numbers, everybody understands that. But when you go into phase 2 or phase 3 trials, the N number needs to be in most payers' minds, and according to our economics folks and actuaries, at least 300, not 100. So I think that that's one of the things that particularly upstart new entrepreneurial companies don't understand, is that they typically underpower their initial study. And because they do that, they keep funding and doing research in the 50s, 75s, and 100s, and they do it 2 or 3 times. And every time they think that they should just lump them all together eventually, they'll come back, the payers will come back and say, well, now all the parameters are not the same. It's very unusual for each study to actually be identical in terms of how it's made up and what its parameters and so on are. So I think that's the other big message that I would give, is that when you're talking to your financial people and when you're talking to your investors and where you're really trying to put your money where your mouth is, your mouth needs to be saying that I did a really good first-time trial, I powered it right, and the N number is right. And I spent my money well, and 3 years from now, I'll have a better story, a better result than if I had done 4 studies that were underpowered. So the N number, I think, is the other thing that stuck out for me. And there was a third thing that will come to me as the rest of you talk.
Well, I'll build on that. I agree with what Jim said, but I'd like to kind of take it another step further in that, putting it in context of the disease state of hemophilia, the population that's selected is a mix of both hemophilia A and hemophilia B. So although they're both hemophilias and they're both treated with factor, and they both would benefit from even a small bump in production of factor 8 or factor 9, whichever is deficient, your population is going to be split. Yep. So there's a natural subpopulation evaluation that will take place because hemophilia A and B are very different. They're treated differently. They have a different one's more common than the other. Hemophilia A is more common than B, and one is more prone to develop inhibitors than the other. And that's important because that's tied to cost. If you have inhibitors, they're much more expensive to treat. Those are patients who cost in the billions of dollars a year, as opposed to hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. So I think that is another reason why having a larger number would be beneficial. The other thing is the comparative nature. Just when this new product comes into market, the people looking at it are going to naturally think, well, what is it compared to? What other options do I have? Then the other options that you have to treat patients with hemophilia are twofold. One, you could just treat on-demand bleeding, just as they bleed. Some patients bleed, commonly, others not so commonly. And then the other option is to treat them with prophylaxis, give them regular doses of factor 2 or 3 times a week to try to control that bleeding. So there's there's reasons why having a greater number would be beneficial. But from a comparative standpoint, even having a before and after comparison would help. Yep. Would help us understand, well, what is the true benefit of this product?
Of the same group, kind of the pre-post?
Yeah, the pre-post. Yeah.
Yeah, and the other point of that is you never want to compound the study. In other words, you want to make it very straightforward and simple as to what disease entity that you're actually doing the study about. So when you, again, throw essentially two different diseases into the same study, one that has a higher population, one that has a lower population, different treatments, different expectations, the whole 9 yards, you just made it messy. So I really think the other message, to go along with what you're saying, Bill, is that you would never want to put two different diseases or two totally different aspects of hemophilia or a general category of disease into your study comparison. You would want to pick either one or the other. I think when it's a disease that has a low number of members in it, or number of patients in it, you can tell I'm from an insurance industry because we call them members, everybody else calls them patients. If there's a lower number of patients, then your opportunity to have a larger N number is less, right?
Exactly.
So, I mean, if you're going to pick something that is a little bit easier to do the research on and the study on, you would pick, theoretically, you would pick the one that has the best or the most opportunity to get patients into the study.
And just to follow up on some of those questions, if you see inconsistent benefit across different patient subpopulations, but they're all within the labeled indication, how do you guys think about recommending or suggesting reimbursement for subpopulations? I know not all systems can handle that, but I think that's just important for the group to hear how that might differ in your assessment. Are there certain populations that benefit more or less, and would those be called out in assessments?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't confuse the reimbursement part with the clinical information and the clinical data and the evidence. I think the most important part of getting coverage positions established in a positive fashion for a particular technology is to make sure that the clinical evidence is there and supports the science and the reason for the medical necessity to be there and for the coverage to be there.
Yep.
I think once that's established, then the reimbursement issues come into play. So many times the technology may actually be more expensive, even in the long term more expensive, but it's still proven that it's effective and it does what it's supposed to do. So at least in all the major payers that I've worked at, and being at Aetna for 18 years, I can tell you that nothing's changed. It's still all about the clinical evidence, and that's how you get coverage decisions. And until you get past that gate, nobody is really talking about reimbursement. And nobody's really talking in particular about the cost-benefit of a particular technology. They really honestly just have to concentrate on the clinical evidence and getting past that gate. Once you're past that gate, then that's where I think all the things that we talked about yesterday come into play about, okay, so now we've got this thing, it's proven, it works, now how do we deal with it? So that's when all the reimbursement discussions happen. That's when the finance people decide whether they want to look further into it. That's when the actuaries figure out whether it means anything in any of the projections. And then all the medical management people come into play. Okay, so now we have this thing. What tricks of the trade do we have to manage this particular medical cost? Do we negotiate? Do we have contracts? If we do have contracts, then do we put them on an authorization list and require pre-authorization for this particular technology? If it's a drug, does it go on formulary? Does it go on tier therapy? All the tricks of the trade, right, pretty much kick in, and it may be all of those things, or it may just be some of those things. But I think it's a real mistake to really think that the value proposition for coverage determinations are economic. They're really not. They really are all about the science.
Which is the
I have a
opposite.
follow-up after that.
The opposite.
Which is the opposite.
For the UK, because
Compare and contrast.
it is about primarily about the value argument. And taking the example of NICE in the UK, it is a hurdle or a barrier to some, but it is a step, and it covers the whole of England. 50 million population. So you've got one big influencing factor, 50 million patient, population. So it's about the therapeutic value, and that what I mean by therapeutic value is how much do patients benefit, you know, in terms of life extension or quality or quality of life. And it's those aspects that everything leads to in the NICE and the other HTA bodies in the UK approach to value assessment. And the ability to which they can assess this and make a recommendation on use of a product is very related to the level and quality of the evidence that comes forward. So taking this, the exemplar we have here, there will be a big groan coming from the HTA body because it's low-level evidence. It's single-arm. They want RCT. It's single-arm. It's small patient numbers. These things have been mentioned already. It's non-comparative. They need to assess relative effectiveness and relative cost-effectiveness against the standard of care. And that could be on demand in adults, but increasingly it's becoming prophylaxis with this example with haemophilia. And then you get into issues of, well, prophylaxis is pretty effective. Not many bleeds happen if patients are adhering to prophylactic regimens. There are other disadvantages, but it's pretty effective. So we see some of these sort of claims, and it's more outside the profile of 50% reduction in bleeds. Well, if the comparator is prophylaxis, that's not actually a very relevant sort of metric or outcome. So we have that problem. But I think the other aspect and limitation to this is the duration of follow-up. How much follow-up is there, and how do we extrapolate these benefits, the bleeding episodes and so forth, to long-run outcomes? We're very keen on long-run outcomes.
That's my number 3.
Yeah, there you go, exactly.
Yeah, we were gonna.
Figured that might be it.
We're gonna get. We're gonna.
We have a follow-up question on that.
And that, when the data is limited or short-term, it means a lot of modelling, and that increases the real problem, uncertainty. All these things add to uncertainty, and uncertainty is a bad, and more certainty is a good. So you want to reduce that uncertainty. There is some sympathy. There is a fair degree of sympathy from an HTA body like NICE and SMC if it's an ultra-rare condition, because it's hard to collect data and do randomized trials in those. And then some other aspects where it's unethical in cancer and so forth to have placebo-controlled or trials or whatever. So it's sort of, there is a sympathy to certain areas. But if the condition is not that rare, then there is a sort of, well, it's regulatory has overcome what we need for HTA. And there's this yeah, you're fast-tracking it through regulatory. There's the excitement. That's fine. But it means the data is not good for the HTA purpose and for health economic.
Yeah, so from our perspective in manufacturing side, we are facing that situation where there are diseases that have been chosen to be on rapid pathways because there's a belief in for example, the EMA, there's an unmet need. Yeah. So this is a specific question based on what we just said. You mentioned the specific focus on the clinical data. If it's published trial data with a comparator, you guys will do your reviews. You'll do your potentially look at indirect comparisons, maybe not in the U.S. As manufacturers, though, with the single-arm data, I have to focus on trying to find the standard of care data to make the case to you that, hey, we don't have that comparator. You mentioned pre-post. That's a question we've had. Do we focus more on just having good pre-post solid, or do we focus on getting that standard of care comparative that may be completely a different data set, real world, and try to tell you that these are the reasons you can make comparisons, we've done matching, blah, blah, blah. Mm-hmm. Are they both relevant? Is one, should we not think about it and just focus on pre-post? We've been trying to gauge that, which one would be viewed as a stronger, assuming we can do a good job on the real world evidence. Yeah. Are both important? For your situation, is that just tossed out and you'd rather have a pre-post that's actually the actual FDA trial? Can you speak to that a little bit? Because that's important for us from a data perspective and evidence generation perspective. The trial data are going to be what they are. Sure. We have to try to augment that for the value argument. Right. So, does that make sense, the question?
And by pre-post, you mean before it's approved and marketed?
No, we were thinking of a pre-post design. Like I think you were saying.
It was like a
same patients 2 years prior to their hemophilia therapy, and then 2 years post hemophilia therapy.
Yeah, so I mean, these patients in the design, they're 18 years old and above. They've had hemophilia. Yeah. because it's usually diagnosed,
And,
as
and
a
you'll
child.
see their pattern of care, their resource use over the 2 years
Right.
prior.
So I would think as you're an adult, your bleeding pattern at that point has probably been pretty close to established. So if you look back 2 years, what's their annualized bleeding rate over 2 years, and then you give this intervention, I see that as believable, as a believable effect. I think I would prefer, two comparisons, but
I understood.
but if we can't do that, then that would be.
But do you need any natural history, separate group of people or do you purely focus on the trial population? That was kind of my question on that issue. As
Well-
thinking about a comparator.
So the preferred one would be, again, a randomization where you take the patients and they go through a normal course of treatment that's the standard of care, and the other arm gets the new approach. And you compare the two, right? So I think that's what is level 1 evidence.
Okay.
If you just do one arm and you want to compare it to historical or retro information, that's next best, maybe.
Okay.
But I'll tell you that in general, they will always want to compare the new therapy to whatever the standard is.
Yeah.
So most of the standard therapies are established primarily by the specialty societies, for the most part. And they will look to what the specialty society says is the gold standard, quote unquote. So if it's a new technology, inevitably it's going to run up against whatever that gold standard is, whether it's within the trial or outside the trial.
Okay.
And within the trial has more power and more impact scientifically, I think, than if it's outside the trial.
You can do some innovative things too with, you can do some innovative things with trial design, and I've seen this with some other gene therapies where, they start off with a comparison between one group gets the gene therapy, and the other gets standard of care for a period of time.
And there's a crossover.
And then cross over into the gene therapy. Obviously you can't cross over the other way, but
But there's some ethical things about that as well. You can't just let the patient get worse and worse and worse when you know something over here is working. So whenever they do these trials, there's always an oversight body constantly looking at the early data, and they'll say, wait, stop. It's killing people. Or there's such a diverse difference between how well this new thing is working and the old one that it's unethical to keep the patient away from the new technology. So there's all kinds of oversight of how these trials are run.
yeah.
Did you want to?
Yeah, no, just I think the preference, there's an acceptance that you've not always got RCT data, and that's always the sort of gold standard and so forth. But there is, I think, the preference from a UK and many European countries, HTA bodies, would be for a sort of natural history cohort or real-world evidence on with the current standard of care, prophylaxis or on-demand and so forth, and or databases that might exist, even if they're retrospective databases. The before and after is used as well, but I think that's the second to that, because there's issues with sort of biases and so forth. I think in those in those sorts of designs. Yeah.
Okay.
But there is some advantage to the to the real-world data versus the trial data, because there's still a bias amongst the fact that you have this controlled population in terms of, the distribution of the of the widget, in a global population. That's when things really start coming out, or the side effects start being evident.
Yeah.
So in one sense, real-world data has a value as well, because it is really not biased by the fact that you picked a controlled population.
There's very interesting. There's some examples going through, not in the regenerative medicines, through the HTA body in the UK, where the company has made a claim for using one of their single-arm trials, open-label single-arm trials, that is more observational data, more real-world, representative, than their RCT data, which had the wrong comparator arm, shall we say, So it was, there was a case made, and it's sort of, in the end, the HTA body wanted both to see the effects of both. But it was interesting that there was a level of acceptance of the argument that this is more real-world representative data and reflects practice. It's sort of open-label adherence comes in, and these sorts of factors that maybe the RCT doesn't design didn't capture. So there are instances where real world could trump some level of RCT, but not in Germany. I'm talking about the UK.
Yeah.
Germany, if you haven't got RCT data or final outcomes and so forth, you're in big trouble.
So just a follow-up on changing gears a little bit. As you think about value horizon, how long do you believe that these therapies will have benefit? A lot of them are one-time treatments with a limited amount of follow-up. How does the follow-up correlate to how long you think these treatments will be effective? Is it limited to just how much follow-up's available at approval, or how much is out there? Like, can you extrapolate out as you do your assessments?
Because we heard yesterday the panel member said, "Oh, in 3 years this pays off." Like, that was the thinking and the mindset was, how many years does this pay off?
Sure.
That's the thing he mentioned.
But I don't think it's just about whether it pays off or not. I think it's more about what does the clinical outcome end up being after 2 years or 3 years. I think it kind of depends on the disease. So if it's a high blood pressure medication, there's a gazillion of them out there. Nobody, drops over dead tomorrow just because of their ability to take blood pressure meds. I mean, it's more of a chronic disease, and nobody gets too excited, right? Yeah. I think there's a different environment when it's a rare disease, when it's a genetic defect disease, when it's cancer or life-threatening. You don't get the luxury of waiting for 10 years to figure it out. Going away from this example, actually, I mean, we can remember bone marrow transplants for breast cancer. I mean, it took over a decade to actually get the science, to actually say, you know what, that it wasn't such a good idea after all. But in the interim, there was a lot of pressure and a lot of push for the early data. Early data sort of said it probably was reasonable to do bone marrow transplants. So we actually learned 10 years later that we were wrong, or that we really shouldn't have been doing them. But at the time, there was enough evidence to think that it was a reasonable approach. I think with cancer in particular, and unlike hemophilia is fairly well treated. It's expensive, but it's fairly well treated. So in hemophilia, I think you would want longer-term studies, and you would expect longer-term studies, and you would wait for longer-term studies. In cancer, usually you get roughly 2 years or so, and you sort of have to make up your mind with what that time frame and information gives you. I think in general, most people want at least 2 or 3 years of follow-up of data. It's very unlikely that they'll accept 1 year or 18 months or whatever. I mean, I think it's got to be 2 to 3 years, probably closer to 3 years in general.
So, but the two of you work in situations where we are required to have extrapolations for the cost-effectiveness model. So, given the short-term data, what are the potential methodological approaches for RM members and folks doing these things to try to make the best case possible on the lifetime? Because these are lifetime requirements you guys are asking for our models.
Yeah, I mean, the main issue is, if it's 1 year data and so forth, that's very short time to, but it's, you're getting no bleedings reduced or no bleedings for the haemophilia example over that time. The issue would be, the science says that should be it. There should be no more bleeding. You don't need more administrations and so forth, retreatment, so forth. That's it.
But you don't know if it's sustainable.
But is it sustainable? So there's that.
So the outcome makes sense to you. It's just whether that outcome is going to.
In theory,
maintain.
it sounds logical and intuitive that should be it. And compared to the comparator, maybe there is uncertainty, there with the comparator. And your shorter-term data for that would be even more worrying because you don't know whether that benefit's going to last. And we're always asking, does the treatment effect wane over time? And NICE are very harsh on this. They would, if there's no data, they assume that treatment effect wanes and goes,
they'll
and then make it up.
They'll
do a sensitivity, and they may even make it the base case. That as I'm experiencing a lot of recently, helping companies make submissions, that they'd be quite harsh on this. The clinicians will get together and guess, well, maybe after 2 years the effect will wane, or 3 years, there's no data, we're just guessing, but that's what they base it on. So sometimes it's pretty subjective, but it's always on the harsh side. So that's going to be with the dealing with the uncertainty. They tend to be pessimistic rather than optimistic. And they haven't got the follow-up data, then they're going to deal more on the side of caution with it. Unless, and this is where there are other factors that come into play, such as high unmet need, the special nature of the condition and the public demand, as it were, for such therapies. The thing with the haemophilia example, that doesn't necessarily, it's not actually, probably those factors don't come into play because, as you say, it's well managed. So it's life-threatening, but it's not life-threatening with current treatments, as it were. So,
Well, that's one we wanted to have. There's going to be other therapies, obviously. It's a good way to. It's a good topic to bring up, that issue of the need. And
and these are the other factors that would maybe there be more on the side of give the benefit of the doubt, and maybe put in a plan of action for further give access, reimbursement, but with long-term data collection plans in place to performance scheme, some risk-sharing schemes as well.
So there's this idea that even the FDA will say the initial data is pretty good. We'll give you FDA approval. We'll give you a label, and this is what the indications are. But we require you to do a registry. We require you to do longer-term follow-up, and we want that information 1 year, 2 year, 3 years out, and we'll reassess whether we want to continue this approval or not. The other dynamic is that, for the most part, once you give something approval or coverage, it's very unusual to take it back. So there's this whole dynamic about thought process about once you approve it, you're pretty much stuck with it. Because the likelihood of you changing your clinical policy, I can only remember less than a dozen times in over 2 decades that we actually took a policy back and said what we approved before we don't approve anymore. It's very rare.
I think the same problem happened in the UK, that it's very hard to disinvest once you've invested in a product and it's being established into practice. It's very hard.
Right.
And once you've given somebody a gene therapy, you can't take it off.
You can't take it off, no.
Unless we've got, we attended a session yesterday about promoters.
How they could turn it off.
Yeah,
I thought that was pretty cool.
But if I can just kind of build on that, it's hard to answer this question without seeing what the data is. I mean, the data package that was presented is, a small phase 1/2 trial with 10 patients and a larger trial with 100. If all 110 patients respond and they had a history of 20 bleeds a year, and it goes down to 0 for 5 years for that 10, and then for 1 year for 100 patients, I kind of believe that. I have a certain level of comfort and certainty about the effect. But if there's a lot of variability there, then I'm less.
I think it's the difference between this cure and this transformative as well. Example here, that if it's put forward as a cure, and it's like. I think you could play that logic, and you could model that through and have a little bit more sort of confidence about the long-term extrapolation. When it's a sort of reduction in bleeds and so forth, is that going to be sustainable? Is it going to be more or less each year, or is that going to wane, and therefore the benefit reduce? And we use a metric called the incremental costs per quality. It's called an ISA, an incremental cost effectiveness ratio, hence the why Bill's agency's name is so appropriate. That we have a threshold of how much we're willing to pay for every one of these quality adjusted life years gained. And what we can see is if it's uncertain in the future, that cost per quality could go up and down and be above or below the threshold. And it's that level of uncertainty that means that the probability of being cost effective is very much reduced, and the payer doesn't want to take the risk because of the uncertainty.
But we don't have that metric in the U.S.
And we have that,
You would not get that metric from NICE to happen in the U.S.
No,
I don't think it would
not
happen.
a debate about that.
Well, that's a separate. We could have that discussion. I think ICER is hoping to have some more of that type of impact. But
Just one other thing on so we talked about sources of value. So in this particular case, we're talking about something that's offsetting existing therapy that's costly. So that's one source of value. Some gene therapies in development will improve quality of life for a patient, but there's not a lot of cost offset, or allow someone who would otherwise die to then live. So these are different kind of sources of value. Some of it's more direct cost, some more quality of life or societal. Can you just talk a little bit about, from your different perspectives, the role of those different sources of value and how that impacts your assessment? I think I know what your response is going to be.
Well, I think
Go
it's, in my mind, it's the clinical data that shows what the result is, what actually happens. I think that, in particular, if it's gene therapy and it is essentially a cure or transformational to a large degree, I think that has a lot of power and a lot of willingness of a payer to consider that the evidence around that is strong enough that it should be covered. I think where the challenges come are around the reimbursement side. Okay, so now we have this. Now how do we address it? How do we fit it into how we adjust premiums? How do we figure out how we're going to manage it? If we have one or two of them, it's probably going to follow the same way we manage it today. We figure it out one by one, onesie, twosie. But I think if there's 900 of them, as I heard yesterday, that would be a game changer. Then I think you're going to have this idea of some kind of collaboration between government, society, and the ones responsible for paying the bills, which can be an insurer or it can be an employer today, in the US at least. Over 75% of the care is paid for by employers out of their own pockets, not out of the insurer's pocket. So most care today in the US, other than CMS, is paid by employers. I don't think people realize that.
This could be an example where you said, what can we do for ARM? We're thinking about the stakeholders to ultimately judge value. It may be beyond the insurance formulary committee at some point for gene therapies to have the full value shown.
And these big corporations, they have their organizations, Leapfrog and all these other organizations that actually put pressure on the payers to be more innovative and to be better at how they manage those medical costs. So I'll tell you that at most of the major national payers, most of the innovation, most of the experimentation about different ways to do reimbursement and different ways to do medical management and different ways to manage the healthcare costs come from the pressure of the employer because they want more result. So I think a lot of the programs that happen, the way the benefits can change, they can change their benefits however they want to change their benefits. If an insurer wants to change the benefits or change the way they do things, they've got to file in each state how they want to change the benefits for that particular insured product. Insured products are all state-driven. The self-insured large customer is under ERISA and under the national rules and can change those benefits and change how they want to do it, however they want to do it. So frankly, a lot of the innovation and the way reimbursement approaches are taking place are being driven by large companies. They're the ones who have pushed for centers of excellence. They're the ones who have pushed for they own the patient. And patients only get this benefit if they go to the Mayo Clinic. And if they don't go to the Mayo Clinic, they don't have the benefit. And an Aetna or a United or Anthem, they couldn't have that kind of a rule. But a self-insured customer can. So I think one of the other dynamics you might see in the gene therapy arena is, let's say this thing costs $1 million, but there's only certain places that really should be doing it, and only certain well-controlled processes to make sure that this therapy is actually handled and done right. And from what I learned yesterday, about there's a lot around that. It's a perfect way for somebody to say, you can only, and I'm just using Mayo Clinic as an example, that you can only get that gene therapy in these 3 places because we already know those are the only ones that basically do it right.
Yep.
And that's the way we create the benefit. And it would be put into the benefit plan that if you're my employee, that's how you get that benefit.
Yep.
So a lot of the innovation that ARM could be working on could actually be through some of these national company organizations or individual companies because they're the ones who can do their own thing.
Yep.
They're the ones who can be innovative and can do it relatively quickly, at least within a year, because they update their plans every year. For an insurer to change things, Oh, it takes us years to get it filed and approved, and then there's a lot of things around the insurance market in the States where they want everybody to be treated the same. So they sometimes don't like this idea of you having to go out of state, for example, to get the care. If I'm in Georgia, they're going to want you to go to Emory. And you can't tell those patients to go to Mayo, right? Even though you know Mayo is where it's supposed to happen.
Yep. So did you want to have some?
Yeah, well, in terms of, I think all the things you've mentioned there, Doug, earlier are very important for the
What have I been working on lately?
yeah, an HTA assessment. So the key things are, yes, the important clinical outcomes like bleeding episodes. They're an important outcome. You know, not too much of a surrogate, shall we say, because they matter to the patient, as it were. And I'm just looking at the exemplar. There's quality of life questionnaires and tools in there that are recognised by the HTA bodies, and that's very useful to have those because quality of life is the key outcome, one of the key outcomes, especially for the haemophilia example, where I don't think we're going to talk about survival benefits over prophylaxis and so forth as much. So I think those are very important data. Some of the things that might be missing from this and which needs longer-term follow-up is some of those cost offsets. So if you so in this case for haemophilia, you might be preventing joint surgery and the impact of that by reducing the bleeds. But you don't have that data. That would take longer-term follow-up. But there is possibly data that you could use, you know, on that relationship between bleeds and joint surgery. But the problem comes with a lot, I think, of regenerative medicines, even maybe in the cancer area and so forth, is if they improve survival. And survival is a key outcome. You know, life-threatening conditions, it has a lot of impact on our metric, the quality-adjusted life year. And the data, even in non-regenerative medicines in cancer, is often very poor. I've just seen a new article that's in the British Medical Journal actually out, I think yesterday or whatever, about cancer therapies. So few of them demonstrate benefits in survival through the trials. Very small percentage. And it's modelling and extrapolation, therefore, that it's based on. And there's uncertainty with that. So the same problem will happen with regenerative medicines in the cancer field. So I think that survival outcome is one of the problems that are very important but very difficult to show.
So Keith, some of those same parameters we would also consider in the U.S., but not under the guise of the economics.
No, yeah.
It would be that we would look at quality of life.
Yep.
We would look at, from a patient's perspective, from the individual, is it something that's more invasive? Is it less invasive? Are there less complications?
Yeah.
They would look at it in terms of the clinical situation of the patient.
Yeah.
Now, you can, in your mind, translate that if they have less invasive procedures, less anesthesia, it's all going to come down to better economics.
But yes, we'd also look at those things.
But they will use the logic or the thinking in terms of clinical terms. I mean, so in a way, when I say we don't look at the economics, it sort of comes into play indirectly. But we don't look for the cost data. We look for the clinical information about how does it affect the patient? How does it affect the type of care that the provider is going to give? Does he actually change what he's doing because of this new test or new technology or whatever? So I think I don't want to overstate the fact that we wouldn't include some of those parameters. We would, but we would look at them in terms of what do they mean clinically, not what is the dollar value.
Yeah, and that's the difference here. Any sort of cost offsets like that would be taken into account explicitly in the model, economic model that NICE applies. And so the prophylaxis, the reduction in cost and inconvenience maybe, and the resource administration costs for that, and if it's any service impact, would all be taken into account. Obviously, it's more certain if it's short term than if it's longer term. That's the difference.
There's one. I would like to ask a question.
Yeah.
And the audience. We'll try to have time for the audience as well.
And I have one last question at the end.
So, Keith, you know, the quality or the quality of life measures, there's quite a few there. You know, there's the EQ5D and the SF36 and the HemoQual.
Yeah.
Is that overkill or necessary?
No, not overkill. Although, from a UK perspective, we're homing on that EQ5D because that generates what we call utility values. That is the metric for the quality-adjusted life years, whereas the HemoQual does, well, it doesn't directly, at least. It is possible to do that, but it doesn't directly. And SF36 doesn't directly, or indirectly it can. But the EQ5D is the preferred measure in the UK and in many countries. So we're homing on that, but it isn't overkill because I think it's also about patient, we're not thinking just about the UK as well. It's also about showing patient benefit, and some of the disease-specific measures can pick up a little bit more sensitivity.
Exactly. With the whole reason we were thinking, we're not, the exemplar, and a lot of companies are thinking this way, the EQ5D, you can pick a lot of it. You're going to face this with vision. The EQ5D's got issues. So even though it's required, you need to...
And that was the reason why I wanted to ask, because I asked somebody else, and they said basically the same thing. That, and this may be relevant to the audience, where you may not be working with hemophilia, but you might be working in another area that has, maybe it's not the HemoQual, maybe it's the NeuroQual, or some other quality of life measure. If you just do that, that might not be enough to calculate, to do economic modeling on. But if you do it in conjunction with the EQ5D, where there is a crosswalk over, and you can show correlation, then maybe you have more of a chance to kind of impact that.
And also thinking outside of the UK, Europe splits into two sort of groups for HTA. Those that like the quali, the UK sort of fans, and there's countries that support that, Netherlands and France to some extent, and so forth. And those that don't like the quali, and that's Germany is the exemplar example of that. But they're very big on patient quality of life benefit, even though they don't like subjectivity. And there's some criticism of subjectivity with quality of life measures. That is a key aspect, and they take maybe more account even of the quality of life measures, the range of quality of life measures.
I would just say that in general, the main thing is to pick a standard tool.
Yeah.
Don't try to make up something. Whatever the standard way of keeping track of whether it's quality of life or anything else, pick whatever that standard measure typically is, and use something that's a well-accepted, validated approach, right?
So we have a little bit of time left. I just wanted to see if anybody in the audience had a question, and then I also have a final. Go ahead.
Thanks very much for the terrific discussion. I guess from the investor perspective, we recently saw Comparator priced at less than $500,000. Many of us are thinking that the Spark drug for essentially night blindness may be priced at twice that. And then when the Avexis drug for spinal muscular atrophy comes out, after Comparator sets some standard of $500,000 for kids' lives, right? These are ALL children who might die. But now we're going to go to an SMA gene therapy for children who might die. We're expecting prices in $2 to $3 million higher range. And then as we look forward, there are other very rare diseases for which there will be no investment opportunity unless the price that can be recognized per patient is $5 million, not multiple. So I guess how are we going to reconcile this whole discussion about value when we've just seen a life-saving drug priced at $500,000, another life-saving drug priced at 10 times that amount? We're trying to navigate and figure out what else should be funded for gene therapy and for curative type therapies.
Well, that's why I think the whole reimbursement discussion is going to have a broader discussion in the society, because the insurance model is that it's a broad population. It includes healthy and sick and dying. And unless you can spread the risk, you can't afford to pay for all of the care. And I think some of the gene therapies, if they get into the millions or multi-millions per patient, it's going to throw all the models and all the way that they currently think about this sort of out the window. I think, under the Accountable Care Act, the reason that it was working fairly well, or has been working fairly well, in terms of insurers being willing to go into an exchange, was because there were higher reimbursements available to those patients that were sicker and riskier. Before enough of the well were obligated to get into the pool. So I'm not sure that there's going to be enough well people to handle the burden of these kinds of expensive therapies. I think it may come to more of a government societal answer of some kind of pooling or some kind of way to handle these exorbitant prices. And I think, from a U.S. perspective, there's going to be a lot of public pressure that these therapies be available for these individuals. I mean, I think there's going to be a huge sort of public pressure to hey, you rich insurance company or you rich company employer, you need to pay this. Look at your CEO, how much he makes. So I mean, there's going to be a lot of political pressure, I think. But I really, and then the other challenge I think we brought up yesterday was this whole idea that how long does any one of those payers have the patient, have the member? So if I'm a particular insurer or I'm a particular employer and I have that individual and I pay $2 million and that individual goes away and goes to another company, goes to another insurer or another plan, the premium or the money that's generated is going somewhere else. I already spent the money.
Yep.
So today, there's not a really great way for the cost, that it's more or less a one-time thing, to be spread out or to be amortized over a period of time. So I really think we're going to have to think out of the box and figure out, is there a way to make this work?
But to your question as well, though, you got to set context. Each disease is different. Just because there's that price for that disease area does not mean that's relevant for other disease areas. Doesn't make it easy. Like you said, it's going to be out there as a price. But my job and others, we have diseases we're working on. We're trying to get therapies to affect people's lives, and there could be a different value proposition. We have to make that case.
So in the UK, there was a mock assessment of a CAR T therapy done by NICE to see if they should treat it any differently in terms of the methods mainly that they apply, and this metrics and so forth, cost of quality. And they decided that on the whole, there's some tweaks and so forth, but largely the current methods could be applied to at least to CAR T type therapies coming along. One of them. Yes. So the new one that's coming, Comparator. The idea then would be the company has to, even though it's a single upfront payment, we'll have to price it appropriately to meet our willingness to pay for cancer therapies under the current assessment rule. So that's, in the UK, that's £50,000 per quality adjusted life year gain. So we'll have to price it accordingly. And that's what this mock assessment did. It assumed the company would price it to the benefits meet this sort of willingness to pay threshold. Now, I think let's go beyond that. There's a number of other issues, and you're talking about even more expensive therapies coming along, even more high cost, maybe in bigger unmet needs and so forth. This is where there needs to be a bit of a debate. Do we treat those specially? Do you have a different willingness to pay for such therapies that is higher?
Right.
The trade-off for that is and we already do have that for very ultra-rare diseases with unmet need, where some of them might fit into that category, but not all of the new regenerative medicines do that. We have it for cancer, as I just mentioned, as well, a higher willingness to pay. Do you set another sort of special case of regenerative medicines like that? The downside is, once you start doing that and willing to pay more for that, you have to take the pot from somewhere. So there's going to be qualities lost because you can't afford now, or not willing to pay as much for other diseases. So it's sort of a bit of a trade-off, and that's where we need this debate again. Is society wanting to value these? And it might do in some circumstances of the type that you've described, children, cure potential, where there's an extra value put on those outcomes or that innovation, as it were. The separate debate is then about affordability. That's about value. Affordability is one we had a discussion about yesterday, and they can't afford to pay that much up front, so there has to be a plan. of annuitization or whatever, and that's the different separate debate.
Okay, yeah.
Go ahead. I'll just add one other thing, because I hear this routinely, and this is an opportunity where this fits with your response to your question is, what else can we stop doing? You know, if we have to make room for these new expensive treatments that are valuable and we want to give to patients, that money has to come from somewhere. So is there other, inefficient things that are happening that we can stop doing? And how do we identify those things? That's kind of a process that maybe the same idea and the lens that we're using to assess these new drugs, maybe we can use that to look at some of the things we've traditionally been doing that at the time was really valuable, but we've moved on. And maybe we don't need to be doing those things anymore.
Well, there's a fair
create
amount of
headroom.
fraud and abuse and overutilization within the system. I mean, the number that they throw out is like 5% of what we pay out in medical care costs is unnecessary. That's a pretty good chunk of change. Mm-hmm. But I think the other dynamic that's happening is you're getting more and more personalized medicine. You're getting more and more personalized, targeted drug therapies tied to certain markers. And of course, the gene therapy is very targeted. It only works in certain patients in certain situations, and it's not really for the general population. We've lived in a world where we pretty much had the drugs out there for broad diseases or broad diagnoses, and it's only recently that we started to say, well, this patient isn't going to do very well on this drug. They really shouldn't get the drug. Somebody else should. But now, from a pharmaceutical company or from a manufacturing perspective, from your perspective, your pool of income or from that patient population gets smaller and smaller. So the prices have to be higher and higher because the research and development doesn't get any cheaper. Mm-hmm. So as we do more personalized medicine, you get higher and higher prices, which is sort of a natural phenomenon. I think the broader question I would say is not where do we just save money within the healthcare spectrum, where do we save money in the whole overall budget?
Right.
Yeah, that's.
So I think we're at time a bit.
No, we're 45, right? 8:45.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we have to be done. You have to be done by.
Yeah.
Awesome. Good.
If you want to.
So when we're talking about these treatments that are multiple millions of dollars and ultra rare, so you're not going to have much natural history, approval may be on 2 dozen patients or less, how do we justify, 2 million versus 3 million as reimbursable, valid reimbursable cost for this medication? It's not going to be cost avoidance elsewhere in the system. What kind of data are governments and third-party payers going to be looking for to say that's a legitimate price for this?
Well, I think that's the difference between NICE and Europe, who's willing to say this is how much a patient's life is worth per year. In the U.S., I don't know that we would be willing to accept that. Yeah. So today, there isn't a price per year in the U.S. There is no limit to how much you theoretically should spend to save a life.
Yeah, but we do have those metrics, but increasingly, if it's the case that you've specified, they're moving towards sort of coverage with evidence development. And it's a bit of a negotiation about the price and the affordability and how we spread that over time and so forth. And I think the message to companies with products like this is to engage with these stakeholders. Don't take an aggressive stance and say this is terrible. It's an engagement because it's a process. NICE have recently said, the head of the health technology assessment part of NICE has recently said they're the institute that likes to say yes. So it is an engagement, and often in these cases of high unmet need, rarity, big benefit, potential benefit, there is a willingness to engage in trying to come up with a plan to collect more evidence if that's the limitation over time while supporting access.
Yeah,
and in the U.S., CMS can do just that. CMS has reimbursement for evidence development. They have that process. None of the commercial payers have anything like that. And the challenge would be CMS doesn't care about anybody that's not 65. So or except for those that have disabilities or whatever, but the majority are 65 and above. They don't even have codes or reimbursement amounts for pediatric patients. So if a lot of these gene therapies are focused on genetic defects and younger people, there's not a government body that pays for that.
Thank you,
Not
sir.
in the U.S.
Some more people. Yeah, back.
Just wanted to make a comment back and expand with that on the price. Because in my view, there is a perception. I mean, the 2 million or 3 million creates a perception around the price itself, but also the budget impact that is maybe misleading. So we already have, if you look at the lifetime cost of orphan and disease patients in the U.S. or in Europe, anywhere, you have many examples of patients with costs well above.
Mhm.
So the system is already taking, let's say, the burden of these patients and the sharing of risk around it. The whole
Yep.
system is already there in place. So you'll never be able to repay patients and orphan disease patients, with the premium paid by the division itself. If the patient is moved somewhere else, goes to another insurer.
Yep.
But that's part of the game, I guess. And for oncology patients, it's the same thing. If you look at the lifetime, I mean, I'm not just saying for pediatric patients, but for any oncology patients, the cost on the specific patient to insure or payer, the healthcare system in Europe are very high. So when you look at the single price, I think it's really an effort that has to be done by all of us in assessing in a rational way, what this price means and what is the real impact on the budget for for the payers and
Yep.
And I think the healthcare systems can pay for expensive stuff. I think a lot of our collective jobs, at least in groups like this, is to unlock those things, to allow for new payment mechanisms, to allow us to realize value over time. The system is not set up for that. And there's a number of groups, including this one, that's a great point. The system can pay for it. And what's different here with gene therapies, it's a commercial entity. Transplants, solid organ transplants, stem cell transplants, other interventions are quite expensive. The systems can pay for very expensive things. It's just unlocking the ability to do so because we've never had a commercial entity with a one-time treatment that could potentially deliver that benefit. And I think that's the challenge all of us face and are working on.
But it's also a larger population, so there's a lot more of those patients that need transplant and all the rest, and so the experience on any one payer is sort of similar. And a lot of the medical management tricks of the trade are to, have centers of excellence for those transplants, have negotiated rates for those transplants. There's lots of ways to sort of mitigate some of that expense. And I'm not sure that we have the same tools or the same ability to get there as easily with some of this gene therapy drugs or treatments that are coming out. That's why I think some of those same things might come into play.
So thank you very much. I have a two-part question. The first is, absent this centralized risk-sharing body, which in the U.S. is likely to require political will to happen, which is at least a couple or several years out, and these therapies are being approved now. What happens at the health plan level? Do these patients get access? Are they locked out? What are the mechanisms that payers will use to actually reimburse or pay for the coverage that's requested? And the second part, which is somewhat related, was the mention of needing longer-term data, more than 3 years of data. Yet there's this balance of the churn that happens at the health plan level of a year and a half. So, what does that solution look like between manufacturers and the health plans to bridge that clinical data gap, given those considerations?
I would say that since this is happening sort of onesie-twosie right now, that it's going to fit into the same mechanism and the same environment that anything else does. So if the clinical evidence is there and the science is there, and let's just say the gene therapy is curative, the data is excellent for what time frame you have data on, insurers would probably cover it. And then what would kick in is all those other tricks of the trade. Do we have an ability to negotiate a rate on that gene therapy? Do we have an ability to make it go to a certain center of excellence and have a even better rate than we would otherwise? Obviously, it would be automatically on authorization. You wouldn't be able to provide the therapy unless you could prove to us that that particular patient was in fact eligible, met the label, all of that. So I think that we would be stuck with taking that cost on, and I think most of the catch-up happens in premiums and in projections a year or two ahead. Most of the rates are all set, and so when a new technology comes, you either have already built it into your plan or you have to adjust it further down the road. So I think as these come out 1, 2, 3, 4 at a time, and the population is relatively small, and it doesn't hit any one payer overwhelmingly more than another one, and statistically they probably won't. I think it's going to be business as usual.
And I just had a quick, so part of the story of Sovaldi's been, it was the budget impact and the lack of planning that people were doing. I'm just, as you think about from your different perspectives, what's the right role for a manufacturer to engage with you in advance, to do make something to help engage with some of your planning and preparation as you do think about long-term budgets and a number of therapies coming in? What recommendations as manufacturers do you make to us to engage with you, talk to you about our plans so you can better plan yourselves? So there's less surprises, there's always surprises. But.
Mm-hmm. I would use an organization like ARM so that a payer isn't bombarded with 600 companies coming to them. So I think that's one approach, is that if it's an organization of reproductive medicine kinds of institutions, I think you got to do it as a group.
Yeah.
I don't think you can do it as, I wouldn't recommend that you do it as an individual manufacturer. I mean, I can tell you that when I was at Aetna, we would get requests for, people to come talk to us, come give us their data and all. I mean, that would be impossible. So, I mean, we really have to look at what's the published data, and we can access the published data, and you can remind us where it is if we're missing something, but we don't need to visit with you. Mm-hmm. So I think that individual access to a major payer is going to be limited. Yeah. I would say what you really want to do is work it through an organization.
So could ARM work with other organizations like AHIP, AMCP, other, where people who are going to be doing that planning or looking at the pipeline, trying to make those business decisions, they exist and swim in those pools. Yeah. Maybe there's some relationship that can be built between ARM and that.
Or some of the large company consortiums, Leapfrog Group, whatever the big...
Especially yesterday, the panel members said, I apologize, about, we don't pay for indirect costs, but that's where the employers do care more about things like that.
Well, so that's a big difference between an insurer, right, who only pays for the medical care.
Yep.
That's it. But 75, 80% of the care is paid by an employer. And the employer, when they pay for care, they also get the benefit of productivity improvements, back to work, less, all those other ancillary things. Yep. And so there's even more value, actually, for an employer to spend money on wellness and prevention and good medical care early on, because they get the full benefit of their employee being more productive as well. Which is why most disease management programs, wellness programs are all purchased and happen because of the employer, not because of the insurer.
So if ARM could, I think it's a great idea, but if on the European side they could maybe set up a forum for discussion of regenerative medicine issues with bodies and invite along representatives from NICE and the other HTA bodies, or even engage with UNETA, the European Network of HTA agencies. That would be a very, I think, a very positive thing to do. I know those agencies are often very amenable to sort of coming to such a forums. Yeah.
And what about, can you talk a little bit about like horizon scanning in the UK?
Yeah,
I mean, that
would be a more
established-
individual sort of company approach to engage with NICE or at an earlier stage, as it were, to raise some of those issues that may be facing and that you'd like to negotiate and discuss a bit more around access, managed access agreements and so forth that could smooth some of the later discussion you're going to have with NICE when you get to the actual appraisal. When you get to actual appraisal, it's manic. So you want to get as much done beforehand when it's more calm. And
Ted, do you have a question?
Yeah, thanks. So imagine a world 5 years from now. This is directed more towards Bill and Nicer. And all the panelists. Do we think that the evidence requirements for HTA in the U.S. will start to look more NICE-like over the next 5 years? As manufacturers, how should we prepare for a U.S. that potentially could look more?
Before we answer that, I'm just interested if
NICE-like.
you're coming from a, oh no, is it going to be more NICE-like? Or yes, that's a good thing to engage. It's be interesting.
Well, it could be
Or
a
neutral.
double-edged sword,
Neutral.
right? It depends on the assets you've chosen to develop. If you think you have a strong value story and you think you can develop compelling evidence that meets that kind of high standard, NICE standard in terms of economic evidence, I would say it's a good thing for us. We can play it to our advantage. If not, then learnings for us as an industry in terms of how we select assets to develop and what things we go after. Anyway, sorry, I'm pontificating.
So I guess my response to you is the ecosystems are very different. The European ecosystem is very different than the U.S., where we have multiple payers. Patients are mobile. There's a very great diversity of payers. Employers think differently than PBM. Sometimes you got the benefits split up between the medical and the PBM, and the pharmacy benefit manager. So there's just a great diversity amongst payers here in the U.S. that I don't think you see elsewhere. And so for that reason, I think we will have to evolve a bit differently. I also think there may be an American mindset that may be different, in terms of our willingness to pay for things, may be different than other parts of the world. So I guess my point is I think we're different, and I think we will evolve a bit differently. And we're still evolving, so I don't really know exactly. But clearly things are changing. I think forums like this where we can talk and understand each other a little bit more really do help. What I hear is that all you have to do is just attend one of the ICER forums. It usually starts off with one party saying, you don't understand how difficult it is to develop this. And the other party says, you don't understand how difficult it is to manage this and care for these patients. And at the end, they both say, yeah, this shit is hard, and let's figure out how to get through it. And then, so once you kind of get through that, you actually kind of can get to...
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm wondering though if regenerative medicines are going to, for the U.S., are going to start crossing the silo pharmacy. Is it a process? Is it medical? I think that you're going to start when the rubber hits the road. It's going to start impacting how these assessments are. That's my view.
Yep.
Because it's not simply a pharmacy issue. It's not simply a device in a medical. I don't know. I'm just curious.
And it brings in issues that we haven't really touched on. Some of these humanistic things that it's hard to quantify the human experience, and we're still evolving towards that. So just one point I wanted to make with hemophilia that we didn't touch on is that not everybody has access to treatment. So there's 130, 140 hemophilia treatment centers, but if you live in, North Dakota, you might not have access to that, where gene therapy has a whole lot of value to you, where you can't, A, get factor if you bleed, B, you can't get to a hemophilia treatment center. Yeah. So the value for that person is quite different than somebody who might live here in San Diego, where you've got one right down the street.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Well, I think the industry is more willing. The industry is much more willing today to have conversations about value-based reimbursement, shared risk, all those kinds of nuances that are relatively new. You didn't have that in the industry 5 years ago. So I think 5 years from now, it will have evolved even more. And I think there will be a lot more opportunity to have those kinds of mutually beneficial conversations in whatever organizations you're in.
Sorry, to ask a very quick follow-up to the point.
Yeah, and then Don, we'll do you after.
And then Don, sorry. You made the point about, industry, the insurance industry being much more willing to engage in value-based payment models and risk-sharing models. At what point, as to steal a phrase from my boss, is the juice worth the squeeze? Like, at what level of budget impact for an Aetna, for example, is it worth to engage in something like that versus, say, a product that might have a $5 million a year budget impact for you?
That's a great question.
Like, there's a logistics burden, obviously, in collecting data and measuring the outcomes and agreeing, okay, you're going to owe us X and truing up and all that. At what point is it just not worth it? You just pay the upfront, and at what point does it make sense to insurance?
Well, I would say it's an evolving challenge because I think a couple of years ago we had maybe 200 ACO kinds of agreements. And then we found out which ones worked and which ones didn't work, who could actually manage an ACO and do what they needed to do. I mean, it's evolving. So I think that it will continue to evolve, and I think it'll get better and better, and we'll realize what things work and how these arrangements are best built, and the evolution will continue. There's very few downside risk arrangements today. I think that may change, and I'm talking about commercial arrangements, not the CMS arrangement. But I think the broader discussion, I think, is what really needs to happen. And as more of these therapies come up and more of these challenges come up, I think there'll be much more pressure to have some kind of a broader conversation.
So good discussion around tension between, I guess, value and affordability. But I want to just talk a little bit more about the value side. Maybe a question for Keith and Bill. And Keith, you mentioned that NICE did the UK mock appraisal for CAR-Ts. But I can't help feel that assessment, they had the wrong research question. The research question should have been, what is the best way to assess the value of these transformative therapies
versus is it fit for purpose?
Does the NICE method work?
Yes.
For CAR-Ts?
Absolutely.
And so a question for Keith, and also, I guess, Bill, from a ICER perspective, as you see these transformational therapies coming down the horizon, and you look at the methods that you currently use to assess them, is there room for improvement, or do these methods work fine?
I think there's always room for improvement. I think I agree with you that they had a narrow research question, or were given a narrow research question, almost to prove the point that NICE is working.
The answer is no, maybe.
Can we just keep doing what we're doing?
Yes, you can. Yes, it works.
Yeah, sure.
You knew what answer will be.
Yeah, but I think there was an Office of Health Economics report afterwards that picked up on that very point, that they should have been asked a broader one. But okay, you can use current methods. You can use current methods for very rare diseases and other things. You can use them. But can you improve them? Was the question that wasn't addressed, really, just as you're pointing. And I think there are some areas of improvement. There's things around discount rates. There's a technical term, and it doesn't very well fit discounting, where you sort of a cost up front is worse than a cost delayed. It's and that doesn't help gene therapies, because you might offset costs later in the line, which have less value than current ones, and health benefits later down the line. So there's some debate around some of the technicalities and some of the tweaks about how you might model and extrapolate that the framework could be improved or changed a bit to account for regenerative medicines. But the bigger question is, do you throw the cost per quality out and have a different metric? There's other methods. Multi-criteria decision analysis is another one. Efficiency frontiers, where you value each attribute rather than the quality. Yeah. Quality might be one part of it, but only one part. There's the attributes of cure, the value on cure, or transformation. Yeah. What's the value of that? The convenience, in the case of a one-time administration versus multiple administrations, and things, it might be the comparator. So that's a bigger debate. I don't think we're going to move there very quickly. It could move, and there's proponents of that. And I think we do use it with certain areas, ultra rare, and we have used it in the UK in a non-quantitative way to make decisions because we're paying. So the cost per quality for some of the ultra-rare Gaucher's Fabry disease drugs, they're at 500,000. Some of the Alexian drugs that come along, you know, that Solaris, 500,000, $1 million per quality, way above any thresholds. Why have we approved those? Why have they got recommended? Because you've used a sort of implicit multi-criteria decision analysis framework. We've taken a lot of other attributes and factors into account, subjectively rather than quantitatively. You could move to a quantification of those through the methods. I don't think it's going to move that quick towards that. I think if it's done, it will be done in a more subjective,
exceptional way?
Yes,
sort of?
yeah, exceptional way. Yeah.
I think that's how they'll handle it in the U.S. too. They'll have to look at what they really are and what they do, and if they're a one-time major hit and essentially a cure, it's probably going to have an exceptional, different kind of approach or criteria that they'll have to use.
I don't think the problem is 900 regenerative medicines. They're not all going to be treated this way differently. There's going to have to be the cream, as it were, the ones with exceptional difference that makes an exceptional difference, gets you masses of benefit.
I know we're up against it, so I'll just take 10 seconds.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Oh,
Okay. Thanks, Mike.
So I guess from my perspective, there's a quantitative approach to doing this with the quality, and maybe there's some things that can be done there. And that's something that ICER's looking at, you know, in terms of maybe instead of our range being $50 to $150 or $175 per quality, maybe for certain diseases and certain drugs, the process just breaks down, and maybe we need to kind of widen that. So that's something we're clearly looking at. But in the interim now, we're also trying to increase our look at these contextual things that help put into context the disease state, where there's just the disease is so severe and so there's things that are just not captured that we can bring out in these discussions, and looking at them both in a qualitative and a quantitative way may help us get to the right decision.
And certainly the uncertainty you talked about and what the impact on ICER, it's good to have flexibility in that threshold.
Right. But payers want to know kind of the apples to apples so that they know, you know, they have to pay for this and other things. So there's just a pull towards that common.
Awesome.
I have one final question unless somebody else does. I guess just one final point. Like, if you could give us all one or two bullets, piece of advice for as either ARM or individual manufacturers, what would you suggest for us to think about coming away from today?
I think my message is to focus on the science and make sure that the clinical data is the best that you can have, and that there's opportunity. I think if the right people get together, to have some dialogue around the reimbursement approach going forward.
So I would say my suggestion is to engage with others to get some ideas on your product, because having been invested in it, you see all the great things about it and maybe blind to some of the things that when you get to a payer, they might say, well, this isn't as great as you might think it is. So it may help you earlier on to get some of that feedback.
I think, both those, the science and engage with the stakeholder, the HTA bodies, but also think about how to make the product affordable to the payer as well, and plans, thinking about plans for spreading the cost.
One quick point I'd like to make before we leave is that payers have changed how they look at their costs and what they need to manage. There used to be verticals: inpatient, outpatient, x-ray, physician, whatever. Now they do a lot more condition analysis. So they look at a condition, which is much more helpful, because the inpatient may go down, the pharmacy may have to go up. Right. All in all, for the condition, it's the right thing to do. So they're not just looking at the one widget, they really are looking at the condition. So if we take hemophilia, they're going to look at hemophilia in general and say that this is what this thing does to how all of this plays, not just one vertical of how it plays. So the gene therapy thing might be really, really expensive, but hospitalizations go down, outpatients go down, all this stuff that is part of the condition. So it's a much more of a horizontal look. I think that horizontal look that more of the payers are doing is also to your benefit, because it's not going to just look at the one.
That's what, yeah.
Thing.
That's the
That's a great
thing I
point,
was
yeah.
referring to. Yeah.
Great.
Good.
Well, I think we're at the hour.
Yeah.
Really appreciate the time, and it's been a good day.
Awesome.
Thank you.